Greetings and welcome to the Dracovin Empire. I hope you're ready to planeswalk to one of the worlds of Magic the Gathering today. Yes, we're heading back to Zendikar to talk about the second set in the Zendikar block, Worldwake, where you'll be learning all about it as we dive once more into the history of these various sets that were released, and going over some basic information about it, some story, all those kind of things. And I hope you enjoyed learning with me. But we must now go through the blind eternities. Take my hand, your host and guide here, Tantasnarf and Dracovin, as I draw you through them into the plane of Zendikar. Remember to, of course, give your tips to me, the one leading you here, with liking, subscribing, ringing the bell if you're over on YouTube to the video, as we go through the blind eternities to Zendikar for Worldwake. So what is Worldwake? Well, it is the second set in the Zendikar block, the one that introduced us to the plane of Zendikar. It had a pre-release on January 30th to 31st of 2010, and its official launch was from February 5th to 7th of 2010. Eventually had a game day on March 6th of that same year. Its lead designer was Ken Niggle, its head developer was Mike Curran, and the art director was Jeremy Jarvis. It was again set on Zendikar, hey, the plane of it. It had 145 cards. Interesting to think that we've had these more smaller sets still back in here that we don't see much of nowadays. Of those 145, 60 were common, 40 were uncommon, 35 were rare, and 10 were mythic rares. It had a development code name of Law, and an expansion code of WWK. Hey, Worldwake. Alright, so that's the basics that you want to know about Worldwake. Let's know a little bit more about what was themed there. Well, very much so like Zendikar, it was themed around lands. Lands were a big part about it. Thematically, it was emphasized in these type of lands. These man lands, as we'll talk about them. Basically, lands that have the ability to turn into creatures. And this basically signifies the version of land theme we will be getting in this set. And then we'll kind of dive into all the details about it. And there were also, at this point in time, again, premium versions of all cards in this set, aka foils. So you could get those random foils sometimes around in various packs. Now this was the expansion symbol. It was similar to the previous one of a Hedron, but this was meant to be a Hedron opening up, revealing what's inside, seeing what's to come in the next part of the block, which we will be dealing with in the future. So, yeah, and here's the mythic version of that symbol here for you. Let's talk about the story. Well, this is all about the ancient forces awakening, causing the world of Zendikar to wreak havoc upon its inhabitants, the dangerous world being more perilous than ever, with adventurers and planewalkers trying to steal its treasure. This was told in two locations. First off, we have the novel, which was Zendikar, the Teeth of Akuma. This was the second part of the novel. The middle part of the novel, I showed this off in the previous one. It tells the entire block story in the Teeth of Akuma. Akum. I never spelled that one right. Akum. Whatever. In its teeth. You see how good I'm pronouncing things. Anyway, that novel told a big part of the entire storyline here. The big thing released in April of 2010. But also we had the story comic, Awakenings, which was told in early parts of March of 2010. Released in 3 parts on the 11th, 18th, and 25th. This focused more on introducing us to the Planeswalker we had introduced in this set, Jace. We're talking about him. And it focused on Jace, Chandra, and Sarkhan Vol, and followed Journey of the Eye. So, these two places are your best bet to get the majority of the storyline of what was going on in the set, if you wanted to dive deeper in learning. Now, our products. Of course, we had 60-card booster packs, as you can see there, and also 6-card boosters that were here. We had 5 intro packs down there at the bottom, and the fat pack, which is right below me. The 16-card boosters featured Jace the Mind Sculptor, Callista Highborn, and Admonition Angel. Probably butchering that one, too. The small booster of 6 cards featured Harabaz Druid. And yeah, these are our products that we had for the set and how you could buy them. Now, for the pre-release, if you went to the pre-release, you get a special version of Comet Storm. If you went to the release event, you get a special version of Jorga Warcaller. Jorga War, both of them actually showing off the new mechanic for the set, which we'll talk about, Multi-Kicker. Now, if you went to Game Day, you get a full art Hada Freeblade. And if you were at top 8 at Game Day, you got the Callistra Highborn. And finally, if you got a full box and you got it from a store, you get the Buy a Box. And in this case, it was Celestial Colonnade. Right down there. That was the Buy a Box card promo. Alright. We, of course, once again had for our 16th card, either Tips or Tricks card or a token in most regular cases. So, the Tips or Tricks card came in a number of forms. Tips or Tricks about landfall, multi-kicker, lands that are alive, allies, and traps. With the back being, or this one showing off one of the backs here to one of these cards with 13 different advertisements, including the next set, Duels of Planeswalkers, Magic Online, Fat Packs, Facebook Guides for Alara, Ultra Pro, all those kind of things. Similarly speaking, we had, of course, the tokens, which would have similar backs, but these tokens were 6 of them. There was a soldier, a dragon, showed here, an ogre, an elephant, plant, and a construct artifact creature with trample. Each for specific cards that could create them. These were the tokens that could be created in the set. There was also a very special event to talk about the introduction to a character, which we're going to talk about multiple times about this card here. We got Jace the Mind Sculptor. Talk about him, but this is some information that I do have to say. I wasn't able to find this article, and it doesn't exist on Wizard's site anymore. But this was something they'd organized. It was a worldwide treasure hunt called the Worldwake Planeswalker Chase. Now, I'm sure there are people out there that could find more information on this. I was unable to. I did search around for a little bit. But if you can find some more information on it, just put it in our comments of the video here. But the Worldwake Planeswalker Chase was a good way to introduce us to Jace the Mind Sculptor, which was introducing us to Jace, which we'll talk about in a minute. We'll talk about it. And his card a little bit. This interesting event was... Alright. There was one misprint in this set. This here. Can you tell what the misprint is? There's Walking Atlas. Creature Construct. Wait a second. It doesn't have Artifact there. It's missing Artifact from the type line. So, yes, it has been mentioned errata-wise. This is an Artifact creature, but the misprint in the set was, it doesn't say Artifact creature. It's a funny misprint that exists in the entire set. Let's talk mechanics. And of course, when lands attack was the theme. And we started with the cycle of dual mana lands. I'll talk about these when I talk about cycles, lands, I'm sorry. They can either produce allied mana, or be activated by using allied mana to become an elemental with some kind of ability until end of turn. They come into play tapped. So, yeah. They also had a set of cycle of Zendikars, which were auras that turn lands into creatures. I'll talk about them in the cycle, but they're related to these. We also got a new variant in Kicker, Multi-Kicker. So we kind of have seen Kicker before in the past. This is basically Kicker, except you can pay for it any number of times. Each time you pay the Kicker cost, it activates for an ability. And it just gives you the chance to repeat it over and over again if you have the mana open. It's a variation that basically allows you to pay the Kicker cost as many times as you can. An interesting variation that allows for much more, if you've got more mana, more open things. Landfall, of course, returned, but it did not solely mark triggered abilities anymore. Basically, more variety of landfall abilities came into play during this set, so we kind of see some that have more static effects, as if a land came into play this turn and things like that. You know, there was a lot more things going on with landfall, and we're expanding upon it. Allies return, with them continuing to build upon it. So if you had an ally deck from the previous Zendikar set, you could continue to build upon your ally set. With vampires, we did have a continuation of this bloodied mechanic that was there. If the opponent had 10 or less life, we had more. And we actually had a pretty big equipment theme with core. The core returned, and much heavier was the equipment theme related to it. Similarly speaking, we also did see quests again. So more quests like we did before, which you get quest counters, and when you get a certain number of counters, you get stuff. And traps, similar to before too. The new traps have alternate costs, some which decrease their cost depending on the magnitude of a certain event. In this case, we have Stone Idol Trap. You know, if a bunch of creatures are attacking, it's a lot cheaper. And then, of course, we have the new Planeswalker, Jace Beleren, being introduced here in Jace the Mind Sculptor. And this is important here because this is the first Planeswalker with, if you would see here, 4 abilities. 1, 2, 3, 4. Normally they're 3. It also is the first Planeswalker to have an ability that requires no loyalty counters to be added or removed. So these are 2 new things introduced here on Jace the Mind Sculptor. It's got the 0 cost thing, and it's got 4 abilities. We'll talk about Jace the Mind Sculptor again a couple more times here before the end of today. It's a bigger card here in the set. But just keeping all that stuff in mind is important here, that this was it introduced a lot of stuff for evolving Planeswalkers at this point in time. Now, the Eye of Ugin is important because, hey, this is a Worldwake spell, and it refers to Eldrazi. Theme of the Rise of the Eldrazi expansion, the following set. At the time of release of Eye of Ugin, the function of, or what the Eldrazi even are, was unknown. Basically, first line of this card, introduced in this set, did nothing. This was made to be played with cards coming in the future. No one knew what Eldrazi were at this point. They referred to them. Now granted, your 7 search for colors creature card, reveal it, put in your hand, shuffle your library, still worked. So cards still had use. But yeah, we have a card here. When introduced, partially did nothing. It was meant to be thematic. Very interesting what they did here. Let's talk about the cycles. There were 7 cycles. Of course, we have this one here, the Common Landfall Instants. Basically, these are instants that have increased effect if landfall was achieved. If you had a land enter the battlefield under your control this turn, it activates. So this one specifically is rather than when a land enters play, like a lot of stuff we saw in the previous set for landfall. If a land had entered, even if you cast this after putting the land into play, we really are going to have to, it gives you that effect. And there was a cycle of these common ones. We, of course, had common multi-kicker creatures, which gave them +1/+1 counters. So there was a cycle in all the different colors for this. The cycle of, basically, our common spell lands. These were common lands, the man lands. They tap for a color. Oh, no, I'm sorry. These are common spell lands. These are the man lands. They enter the battlefield tap, they tap for a color, and have an appropriate enter the battlefield effect. Halimar Depths here, hey, look at the top 3 cards of your library, put them back in any order. So, you know, it came into play tapped, it tapped for a blue one, but it gave you an effect. And there was a cycle of these lands that would give an effect of various different kinds. The Zendikar cycle spell, of course, I mentioned them when I talk about the man lands. These make things into man lands. They're common auras that turn lands into creatures, and the spell returns to its owner's hand if put in the graveyard. So, you know, the enchanted land, if the enchanted land is put in the graveyard, you get the spell back. If you disenchant, get rid of the actual enchantment, you don't get it back, but, you know, it gives up to that. And then, of course, you have the allied beneficiaries. These are 5 creatures that get better if their control also controls a land of an allied color. The black one here, of course, if you control an island, you get a card. Basically, these were a cycle of creatures that made to be played together with a multicolored deck, at least of allied colors. Now we get the man lands. The tap man lands. These were introduced, of course, Creeping Tar Pit here, who becomes an unblockable creature. Each one became a creature of a certain power and toughness that usually had an extra ability in it. There is an outlying uncommon land that turns into an artifact. It produces colorless mana, Dread Sanctuary. I didn't show that here, but I do want to mention it because it is kind of a weird outlier that's not really part of the cycle, but kind of can also kind of be considered a side thing to the cycle. But yeah, I talked about these earlier. They're rare. They tap for a pair of allied colors. They all turn into creatures that require that mana. There's similarly a cycle of enemy-colored activated traps. Basically, these were traps, and one of the enemy colors triggers it. Like here, the black one requires you to have a white creature to attack to trigger it, and each one would have a similar thing. They're uncommons, and the alternate cost just is an enemy color. Has to do some kind of thing. There was, of course, the Mega Cycle, which I had mentioned in a previous video on Zendikar. And, you know, our add to this one, because it was a Mega Cycle between all 3 sets of Planeswalkers of color. Jace is a blue one introduced here. We had Sorin, Chandra, and Nissa for the black, red, and green. We'll get our white Planeswalker next set. We'll talk about that Mega Cycle there. But yes, together, we're getting the 5 colors of Planeswalkers here. There is one matched pair. I talked about the previous one, Cliff Treader. In this one, we have Marsh Treader. Cliff Treader got Mountain Walk. This one gets Swamp Walk. They're 2/1 core sets, cores with Landfall. Now, there were some reprinted cards. We had Quicksand here there at the top. This was first printed in Visions, last seen in 10th edition. It's rare. It changed rarity from uncommon to a common in this version of it. So we kind of have a interesting reprint there. We had Smother. Now, Smother was last seen in Onslaught. We're now getting a print of it here. And of course, Twitch, which was first printed in Tempest, is last seen in 10th edition. So these are all 3 cards that are reprinted in this set. It's not a lot of reprints in this one. We did get a functional reprint, though, with a Goblin Rough Rider, which is effectively from the original kind of Portal starter sets. Goblin Cavaliers is getting a much more print. You know, the starters, the Portal sets, we didn't see them as much. They were kind of interestingly printed. So getting the Rough Riders was a way of getting it more into more hands. And finally, we did have some color-shifted cards here. We, of course, had a Loam Lion, which was a color-shifted version of Curd Ape. Curd Ape getting bonuses for having Forest, and now with similarly White also getting a bonus for Forest. Hey, both of them are allied with green. Makes sense there. The color shifted there. And the other one is, of course, Drag Wasp Swarm, which is basically snapping Drake from Magic 2010 or the Portal sets, and similarly Portal 2nd Age had Talos Airship. I didn't show it here, but, we had a couple of... we had a functional reprint there with those two, and we have a color-shifted version of a functional reprint here, interestingly enough. Let's talk about some notable cards from the set that you might want to look into. Abyssal Persecutor. It was notable for being an undercosted creature with an unusual drawback, and basically the reverse of Platinum Angel's ability. Basically, if it's in play, its controller is unable to win the game, and their opponents can't lose. An interesting, weird little effect there. Arbor Elf is an interesting one, because it untaps a land. It's seen in a lot of ways as being worse for not being able to tap for mana directly, but there are a bunch of non-basic lands that have the forest type. This combines pretty well with. And there is some very big things, like certain enchantments and stuff like that, where, like a Utopia Sprawl, which changes a land into a forest, that can open up some big possibilities working with Arbor Elf. So it was an interesting one to add into the mana dork kind of cycle of things. Avenger of Zendikar was a key finisher in the standard ramp decks of the time, and it is an iconic creature in the Commander format now, where you get plant tokens for having lands under control, and the landfall ability of making plants bigger. The Amulet of Vigor was the crux of a Primeval Tywin and Bounce lands, and it's using Amulet of Vigor in that deck got Summer Bloom banned, I will say. It's still powerful and still legal as a deck. It's basically got a reputation for high highlighting difficulty for the current deck that uses Amulet of Vigor. So it's in some big name decks. So you can see that, you know, if permanent would enter the battlefield tap, under control, untap it, it basically opens up a lot of ways for a lot of things there too. The combination of cards here was very defining in Standard. They basically handled most creatures on their own. Basilisk Collar and Cunning Spark Mage. Spark Mage. Basilisk Collar giving your creature a Death Touch and Lifelink. A Death Touch, if it deals damage, you destroy something, and Lifelink, you gain it. Cunning Spark Mage, you tap, deal 1 damage to target creature or player. It killed a lot of things that day. It was, these 2 cards from this set were pretty deadly. Bestial Menace was basically, it was proposed a number of times for various sets under the name Cone of Creatures, kind of like Cone of Flame. But, you know, with its confusing tokens, it was often scrapped. As soon as we got creature tokens, that's when they finally printed it, basically. They had this idea of having a bunch of different creatures for one spell, and we're finally seeing it printed here because of the tokens. So we finally have them. We can have snake tokens, wolf tokens, elephant tokens, and because of that, hey, we're finally seeing it as something that was kind of in the minds of producers before that. Hey, Bojuka Bog! It sees play in Modern, Legacy, Pauper. It's basically graveyard hate. And, you know, decks that can easily tutor for lands and stuff like that. Exile are cards from target player's graveyard that enters the battlefield. Bojuka Bog is infamous to any kind of, hateful to any kind of deck that uses the graveyard. So, yeah, it shows up in a lot of places. Definitely sideboard in a lot of places, too. Death's Shadow is the creature with the highest, creature with the highest power and toughness on it at the time. Higher than the previous one, Phyrexian Dreadnought, which had been a 12/12. So yeah. Now there are creatures with higher power and toughness now. But at the time, for printed at very least, I'm not talking about things like the Merit Log token, which is a 2020, that's a token that came in like Cold Snap. Here, we have this previous one. The creature became a threat in Modern, and strangely, it took until 2017 for this to be known, for despite all necessary pieces having been printed for years. Basically, in 2017, it became a very big threat in Modern, which is 7 years later. Modern figured out, hey, this is really deadly. We should use this in our format. Yep. Dispel, a cheap and but restrictive counterspell that sees a lot of play in sideboards in any format that basically combat opposing counter magic and removal. You know, it's basically countering people's counters, people's instants a lot of time. It sees play in a lot of sideboards. Explore is a ramp card that was played in standard decks. Hey, landfall, a lot of that stuff, you know, pretty big there. Horizon Chick had protection from lands. And this ability gave a creature with protection every type of classic permanent. We had now protection from creatures, protection from artifacts, protection from enchantments. We've seen protection from planeswalkers. You know, again, these things are printed at different times. But this one here, we have cards with protection from things. Protection from sorceries is the only one that's missing, but there's something that kind of gives it for granting protection from instants and sorceries. Yeah. But, you know, anything else, we've got protections against most of the things, and this is adding to that list. So, interestingly speaking, it's part of this weird cycle that we kind of built up in Magic. Core Firewalker, pretty big heavy sideboard card against aggressive red decks for most of Modern. Nature's Claim is a heavily played sideboard card against artifacts and enchantments in every format where it's legal, as it only costs a single mana and has minor downside. Searing Blaze serves as an effective spell for burn decks in Modern and Pauper. Tectonic Edge is reminiscent of older lands like Stripmine and Wasteland, and was included in the set as a tournament-viable answer to Man Lands. However, the empowering of Tron as a deck rendered it ineffectual. So for a while, this was good, but it eventually fell out. Basically, fighting against manlands and being like that strip mine wasteland kind of replacement. So it had some popularity for a while. Treasure Card has a unique design that can easily draw a player their entire deck, or close to it, for 2 mana if they choose to play a few non-land cards. Yeah. Weird that way. And finally, Rexel the Hidden Deep was designed by Ken Nagel as a commander he wanted to play and used to punish people who take extra turns with cards like Time Warp and Time Stretch. So yeah. Again, this is back during the EDH time, I think. We hadn't quite called it Commander yet. We were still Elder Dragon Highland. But with the format growing in popularity, even back then, Ken Nagel was putting things together. So it's interesting to see that the popularity of the Commander format is very old, even before it was called Commander. Let's talk bans and restrictions. And of course, Jace here. Jace, my boy. We've talked about you a number of times today. Yeah, he was once the most powerful planeswalker ever printed. Widely played in control, aggro decks of all formats. With Stoneforge Matrix, they were the first cards to be banned in Standard for nearly 6 years. And a few months later, he was banned in Modern in August of 2011, and then extended in 2011. Now in 2018, he was unbanned to much faster Modern, where he still sees some minor play. And his reputation has been challenged, of course, by Oko and Random Sticks, the original Oko, Thief of Crowns, and of course, Teferi, Hero of Dominaria for control. But yeah, so he's, Modern, Extended doesn't really exist anymore, the same way. It's not like really played the same way. But yes, he was banned in Modern for some time, banned in Standard when he was in it. Now he's out of ban, but for 7 years, he was banned in Standard. And of course, speaking of, Stoneforge Mystic, had a lot of tournament play in multiple formats, serving as a cheap tutor and capable of being a 2-for-1. It was banned in Standard, extended in Modern in 2011. It was later unbanned in August of 2019. Basically, not much fanfare, but with printings of Urza Saga, made it a key choice in Colossal Hammer deck. So by the time it was unbanned, not as important anymore, but yeah. Eye of Ugin. It was foreshadowing a piece of story, mentioned the Eldrazi, a Type 3 released. It had some fringe plays, not tapping for mana had a liability, and after the Zendikar block, Eldrazi were no longer merely a 7 mana over Haymakers, multi-curve impacts with Eldrazi Temple. It was banned in April 2016, shortly out of the breakout performance in Pro Tour Oath of the Gatewatch. Basically, as soon as we returned to Zendikar and had more Eldrazi, it became very powerful. So, that's why, yeah, it became eventually banned. Wasn't much when it started, but by 2016, it became big. Lodestone Golem is a artifact creature that's a taxing one. It makes up the Mishra's Workshop deck in Vintage. Being an impactful creature capable, castable off Workshop, made one of the stronger lock pieces, and it was restricted in 2016, meaning you can only have one in your deck. So it is not a banned card, it is a restricted card in Vintage. And Hada Freeblade is technically banned in Pauper. Now, I didn't show the version of it, but and this is on Magic Online. Being that in Magic Online, there was a promotional version of Hada Freeblade that was printed at Common. It's technically available in format, and technically having only printed at Common as a promotional card because of Magic Online. With Magic Online, you could get physical versions of cards. It was hard to do, but basically what was, there were physical versions of the common version of this card as a promotional one that made it common, so it's technically banned in Pauper because it was that promotional and linked to Magic Online. So yeah, it's an interesting, weird place it's banned in Pauper. It's an interesting world, a little bit there. Let's talk about the intro packs to finish out. There were 5 of them. 1 was multicolored, and 4 were dual-colored. Of course, we had Brute Force here, which was a red-green that focused on multi-kicker, giving you very large competitive monsters. Its rares were the Wolfbriar Elemental I showed foil earlier as a holographic foil, and Terastodon. Terastodon having the ability to destroy a number of permanents and replace them with elephants. Wolfbriar Elemental allowing you to get a lot of wolves. Overrun was in this deck, Act of Treason, Giant Growth, Lightning Bolt. There's a whole lot of other cards, a lot of creatures. Multi-kicker was a big part of this entire thing, to get a lot of big creatures out, pump them up, throw them out there, hit there with a little bit of burn with Lightning Bolt and such like that. Our monocolor deck was Fangs of the Blood Chief, our black deck, and it was Vampire Tribal. Of course, the big ones here were Butcher of Malakir, which was our holographic foil, which was basically gave a Grave Pact effect. I haven't talked about Grave Pact in a while, but basically the effect is when it or another creature you control dies, each opponent sacrifices a creature. So basically having a graveyard deck where you're sacrificing creatures or bringing them back means that you're fueling this thing of you get rid of stuff and get effects and then cause your opponents to lose stuff. Black token decks really like things like this. I like the Butcher in some places. I've used Grave Pact too. And of course the other one is Anowan, the Ruin Sage, which at the beginning of your upkeep, each player sacrifices a non-vampire creature. Hey, you have a vampire deck. You sacrifice class creatures. You're forcing your opponents to sacrifice a lot of stuff. And the majority of your creatures are vampires. So with a few exceptions, you don't have to worry about that. And with a few cards to bring some creatures back, a Diabolic Tutor to search, you have some ways to feed the Butcher and basically cause some pain and suffering to your opponents. Flyover, a blue-white deck, again focusing on multi-kicker, but a little bit more flying creatures rather than the ground. When we had our green deck, it was kind of a stompy multi-kicker deck. This is a kind of flyover, hit you one there. Our 2 main things are Archon of Redemption for our foil, where it or another flying creature enters the battlefield, being gained life equal to its power. Hey, a lot of life gain. And of course, Martial Anthem, which gives creatures you control +1/+1, and if you kick it, for the multi-kicker, you return creatures from your graveyard to the battlefield. So it's not only you're giving your people like a boost of a little power of your creatures +1/+1, but if you have a lot of open mana and a bunch of creatures have died, you can bring back and get a big wide swing of creatures. Having blue, you have things like Sleep to tap all your opponent's creatures, Pacifism to shut things down, things like Unsummon. A bunch of various creatures to boost up your flying groups from both blue and white, and a bunch of multi-critters. We had a blue-green deck focusing on Landfall, Mysterious Realms. Of course, our rares here are Goliath Sphinx, which was just a big creature that flew. It's an interesting one to be the holographic there. And of course, Seer Sundial, which was an artifact with only a landfall effect, where you could pay 2 mana and draw a card, and you had it land under your battlefield under control. It had some treasure hunts in there. Hey, remember Treasure Hunt? I mentioned that? That pops up in here. Yeah. And a large number of creatures, basically, with landfall effect. It also had a Living Tsunami in here, where at the beginning of upkeep, you either sacrifice it unless you return a land to your hand. Living Tsunami, basically, was a big part of landfall decks. I don't know if I talked about it in the Zendikar. I can't remember. But it basically allows you to return lands to your hand and replay them, and this worked very well if you're in this deck. Basically, if you needed to get lands back and replay them, you could have Living Tsunami out. And again, you could choose not to return a land, or you could just basically, if you feel like you have enough mana, you could constantly be bouncing lands back and forth. And you also have things like the Halimar Depths in there, which you could bounce back and forth and constantly cycle out the free cards at the top of your library. Just saying, keeping that landfall. And then we had Rapid Fire to finish out our intro packs, which is our red-white one, and another landfall. So we had 2 multi-kicker decks, 2 landfall decks, and a vampire deck here. This is one that is meant to crush your opposition under an avalanche of creatures. Our rares, of course, were Mordant Dragon as the holographic one here, which had a Fire Breath ability, paying mana to get it +1/+0. a little bit more expensive than the standard Fire Breath of 1 red. When it deals combat to a player, you have it deal damage to a creature they control. And of course, the other one is Chain Reaction, which deals X damage to each creature over X number of creatures on the battlefield. A nice, damaging board one. Other things like active treason to steal a creature, narrow escape to return a creature to your hand and gain 4 life. That's a nice way to save one of your big creatures. And, things like Prodigal Pyromancer that tap to deal some damage. And Dragon Whelp, get a little bit of that fire breathing. So you kind of mix in some of those things to throw out a lot of creatures and having some extra landfall effect in there, too. Some interesting little extra deck there, too. Things like the Step 6. But yeah, there you go. That's Worldwake. An interesting deck, definitely. Or an interesting set. It was an interesting set because we see it as it's one of those things is we always look at a block of cards a lot of times when we're talking about sets. We see how Zendikar, the block, introduced the plane, the world, and all these things, but Worldwake kind of extended the story and extended the mechanics. I think that was an important part about middle blocks of sets. Middle sets in a block sometimes. Expanding format in a way. We've seen Landfall evolving, Kicker becoming multi-kicker, and certainly speaking, we're hinting at where things would go will Rise of the Eldrazi, when there will be some major changes and new abilities that we'll see, and I think it's the big end of the game, the end of the rope swing there, something different. It's a much larger set, and this kind of smaller middle set does its very good job of kind of filling in the gaps in the story and the format. As if we're talking, if I build a block, a set of cards out of the Zendikar block, we kind of see it evolving. It's definitely an interesting one with a lot of really cool cards and introducing a lot of stuff. I think that's one of those things that this set can be a little overwhelming in a way, of the much of stuff it does introduce. Ideas of multi-kicker, the evolution of landfall, Jace, new types of planeswalkers, Eldrazi. So much stuff is just kind of introduced and evolved in this set. It's kind of a mess in a lot of ways, but definitely interesting. Anyway, I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to say thank you for joining me today. I hope you did enjoy diving into Worldwake today. Remember to check out my schedule for any kind of time I do any of these videos or anything up online on Twitch or upload these up on YouTube. That's going to be on my Discord, Twitter/X, my Blue Sky, and my YouTube. Tells you when I'm going live, either record a tabletop video or play some games, or uploading something. Usually these schedules are pretty exact, but if there's a change of them or anything that's going on, I'll update people. Usually on my Discord first, and sometimes over on my other social media. But that's the best place to see if there's any updates to the schedule. Remember to, of course, give the things to support the channel via the like, subscribe, ring the bell. My question today is, have anyone out there played Worldwake? I got some cards from Worldwake, but I never dived into as deep. I started getting back into Magic a little bit in the Zendikar block, but it wasn't until Scars, which came after here, where I really dove back into Magic and returned to it after some years of break around the time of post the Invasion block. I kind of had a little bit there in between, but I really didn't dive into it until we got back into here. And I started grabbing cards from these sets during this time, not in huge numbers. It wasn't until Scars that I did. But that's why I can kind of tell my story of my experience with Worldwake. Do you have any similar stories to my own? What's your experience with this, or have you experienced anything? Any cards from it that may have the reprints in it too? Because we do see there's a lot of new cards in it too. Maybe you got a Jace from somewhere. You can print it up again, post there. Hard to say. Anyway, I think that's everything for today. Said all my stuff. Remember to check me out on any kind of updates on anything on my social medias. Anyway, let me get going. Maybe do some stuff with Twitch, maybe record some more stuff. But until the next time we talk about another part of Magic history, Magic lore, maybe something else related to Magic, other stuff related to tabletop stuff, I bid all of you out there adieu and wonderful. Farewell.